Part 2, Serfdom in Eastern Europe. Our objective for this section is to explain European commercial and agricultural developments and their economic effects from 1450 to 1648. And our key concept for this section is as Western Europe moved towards a free peasantry and commercial agriculture, serfdom was codified in the East. That means it was like legalized and entrenched in the East, where nobles continued to dominate economic life on the estate. So basically what we're going to see is that the complete opposite is going to happen on either side of Europe. In Western Europe, after the Black Death, serfdom sort of goes away. And then in Eastern Europe, it's actually going to increase and, like we said, become codified, which means like legalized and formalized. The major themes for this section are going to be primarily economic and social. So the rise of serfdom in Eastern Europe. After 1300, lords in Eastern Europe revived serfdom to combat increasing economic challenges. And the areas most affected by this included Bohemia, that's modern-day Czech Republic, Silesia, which is sort of in the area of Poland, Hungary, Eastern Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. So again, looking at Central and Eastern Europe here. The drop in population in the 14th century, especially from the Black Death, created tremendous labor shortages and hard times for nobles. But like I said, there's going to be a very different reaction in the East than what we see in Western Europe. Lords, meaning the nobility, demanded that their kings and princes issue laws restricting or eliminating peasants' right of free movement. And by 1500, Prussian territories, so that's kind of like German regions, had laws requiring that runaway peasants be hunted down and returned to their lords. So you can see that this serfdom is starting to resemble slavery in some ways. And laws were passed that froze peasants in their social class, and that prevented any type of upward social mobility by the peasants. In addition, lords often confiscated peasant lands and also imposed heavier labor obligations on the peasants, and sometimes these were even the free peasants. The legal system was entirely monopolized by the local lord, much like we saw it with feudalism in the Middle Ages. And even non-serf peasants were affected. Because remember, not all serfs are peasants, but not all peasants are serfs. And so even the few non-serf peasants that remain were actually obligated to participate in something called robot, although it's probably pronounced robo. Where in certain regions, peasants were required to work 3 to 4 days without pay per week for their local lord. And, that's obviously going to be something that they're not happy about. But these are laws saying, like, you have to work for free for your lord. Doesn't matter if you don't like it. This is what you got to do if you're a peasant. So life is not very good for peasants, as we can see. As serfdom is consolidated in the early modern era of the 16th and 17th century, we'll see that hereditary serfdom was reestablished in Poland, Russia, and Prussia, again, that's kind of the German regions, by the mid-17th century. In Poland, nobles gained complete control over their peasants in 1574 and could legally impose death penalties on serfs whenever they wished, for basically whatever reason as well. And in 1694, the Russian Tsar rescinded, meaning he got rid of, the 9-year term limit on the recovery of runaway serfs. So basically what this law had said previously to it being canceled by the Tsar is that after 9 years, you had to give up on trying to find your runaway serf. But he's like, you know what? Keep looking for them forever. It's okay. If they're ever found, then they would be returned. So that basically is very similar to some of the patterns we see with American slavery, in the years leading up to the American Civil War. This period also saw the growth of estate agriculture, especially in Poland and Eastern Germany. Food prices increased due to the influx of gold and silver from the Americas. So even that Atlantic trade was being felt as far east as Poland and Eastern Europe. And surpluses in wheat and timber were sold to big foreign merchants who exported them to feed the wealthier West. And this is a pretty common theme we see through and dynamic we see throughout European history is that the East is the breadbasket of the West. The West will be wealthier, it will have bigger cities, a higher population, especially concentrated in the cities. And Eastern Europe will tend to be poorer, more agricultural, and provide a lot of the grain for Western Europe. And that dynamic continues like into the 20th century, basically. Now, of course, this is all these developments that we're talking about here is in direct contrast with Western Europe, where peasants gained more freedom in the 15th and 16th centuries, though it is important to note that they still worked in similar conditions. Like peasants still worked in agriculture. They didn't have a very high standard of living. They still lived in villages and manors. They were still very dependent on the local lord, but they weren't treated like slaves like some of these serfs in Eastern Europe were. So let's unpack that a little bit. Why was there serfdom in Eastern Europe and not in Western Europe as we move into the modern era? The reasons were not necessarily economic, actually, as the West was also devastated by the Black Death, and the resulting labor shortages actually helped labor in the West. You might remember discussing this in Unit 0, where basically, since labor became a commodity in high demand but short supply, the price of labor, meaning the wages, went up. And that's one of the things that really contributed to the decline of manorialism in Western Europe. But actually, in Eastern Europe, it was the political reasons that are more plausible, meaning more realistic as to why serfdom increased. And this really has to do with the supremacy of the noble landlords in Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe had a very different idea about kings than Western Europe. You know, in Western Europe, we've been talking a lot about divine right, and that, in a way, can be traced even all the way back to Charlemagne when he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Church in the 9th century. But in Eastern Europe, most kings were, in fact, essentially what we call first among equals in the noble class, and they too also directly benefited from serfdom. So they did not quite have the same level as the kings in the West. Eastern lords also had more political power than those in the West, and because of this, monarchs in Eastern Europe really needed the nobles in order to legitimize their support and consolidate their power. Also, constant warfare in Eastern Europe due to like the Ottomans and many other potentially aggressive groups. So that constant warfare and the political chaos resulted in the noble landlord class increasing their political power at the expense of the monarchs. Again, we have to remember that Eastern Europe really dealt with the threat of the Ottomans much more than Western Europe. Weak Eastern kings also had little power to control landlord policies aimed at peasants. And really, we do not start to see strong sovereign kings in Eastern Europe prior to 1650. So that means Eastern Europe did not see the same rise of the new monarchs like we saw in Western Europe. So remember the late 15th and then throughout the 16th century, we talked a lot about those new monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, Henry VII, Henry VIII, the Valois dynasty in France. All of those guys were considered new monarchs, but in Eastern Europe, there's not the same pattern of political sovereignty that develops. Although Eastern Europe will eventually get to absolutism. That is, after all, what this whole lecture is about. Also, peasants were politically weaker than they were in the West. Their uprisings did not succeed, and there wasn't as much peasant solidarity as there was in Western communities. I'm not really quite sure the reason why for this. I think probably just less ability to communicate, even lower literacy rates, if that's even possible. But generally, there wasn't as much peasant solidarity and community in Eastern Europe. And landlords undermined medieval privileges of towns and the power of urban classes. So that's another very different sort of demographic and social dynamic we're seeing in the East. In the West, towns were actually pretty powerful and independent. Urban classes, like the bourgeoisie, could also hold a lot of political, social, and economic power. But in the East, they don't play the same role. In fact, the population of towns and the importance of the urban middle classes in Eastern Europe declined significantly. So like I said, in Eastern Europe, we're going to have a really powerful nobility, a very oppressed peasantry, and quite frankly, not much in between. Whereas in the West, we do have these some of these middle classes, like the bourgeoisie. Although keep in mind, they are still a very, very small percentage of the overall population, even in Western Europe. Okay, moving into part 3 of our lecture, where we now get to talk about those new empires of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Our objective for this section is very similar to what we've seen previously. We're going to explain how absolutist forms of rule affected social and political development from 1648 to 1815. And several key concepts here. First one, as a result of the Holy Roman Empire's limitation of sovereignty in the Peace of Westphalia, Prussia, which as we will see is pre-Germany, rose to power, and the Habsburgs, centered in Austria, shifted their empire eastward. So obviously that's going to be one of the big key concepts that we focus on for this unit, or for this lecture. A second key concept, Louis XIV's nearly continuous wars, pursuing both dynastic and state interests, provoked a coalition of European powers opposing him. So in this lecture, we'll also talk about some of Eastern Europe's participation in the wars, like the War of Spanish Succession and the War of the League of Augsburg, in their attempt to maintain a balance of power in Europe in the wake of Louis XIV's ambitions. And so, as a result, some of this material may actually be related to sort of like a 3.6 topic, which is really about balance of power. But I decided to just kind of keep it all wrapped up into this 3.7 lecture on Central and Eastern Europe. Key concept number 3, absolute monarchies limited the nobility's participation in governance, but preserved the aristocracy's social position and legal privileges. This is going to be similar but also different from what we see in Western Europe. We already can tell that the nobles are going to have more power, but how exactly do the monarchs limit their participation in government? That'll be sort of something interesting to explore and unpack throughout this lecture. And then our last one, number 4, Peter the Great westernized the Russian state and society, transforming political, religious, and cultural institutions. And later we'll talk about Catherine the Great, who ruled in the 18th century, and she continued this process. And while Catherine the Great is a fantastic and fascinating ruler, that's unfortunately going to be another story for another day. For now, we are moving on to the rise of Austria. So the ruler of Austria, who was obviously going to be a Habsburg, was traditionally selected as the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Holy Roman Emperor continued to be a position even after the Peace of Westphalia, and it was a very powerless position, but it still went to the ruler of Austria, which, as you will guess, is a Habsburg. After the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century and the Treaty of Utrecht that followed it, remember that's an important treaty to remember, the Spanish throne was now occupied by the Bourbon monarchy, whereas Habsburg power would now be concentrated in Austria. But Austria is going to become a pretty expansive empire with lots of territories. And you might remember that the Treaty of Utrecht granted a lot of the sort of peripheral Spanish possessions to Austria to sort of compensate for their loss of the Spanish monarchy. So the Austrian Habsburg Empire in the 18th century included Naples, which was really most of southern Italy, Sardinia, which is an island off the coast of Italy, and Milan in northern Italy, the Austrian Netherlands, which is basically Belgium, and more territory in Eastern Europe, such as Hungary and Transylvania. Transylvania is modern-day Romania and also the home of Dracula. Now, here is a pretty useful map for us. This is a map, of course, of the Austrian Empire. You can see in yellow there's Austria proper, and that's more similar to how Austria looks today, although today Austria does include a little bit more territory than that. You can see the capital city, Vienna, is situated there. Remember, during the 30 Years' War, Bohemia is added to the Habsburg territory. That's the whole conflict in the Bohemian phase of the 30 Years' War. Ferdinand makes Bohemia basically a personal possession of the Habsburg family. So that's added to the Austrian Empire. Later on, Silesia is added to the Austrian Empire, but they will lose that to Prussia in the 18th century. That's another story for another day. A large part of their empire was made up of Hungary, especially as the Ottoman territory receded throughout the 17th and 18th century. The Austrians were able to incorporate lots of Hungary. So what you see here is kind of like the main area of the Austrian Empire, although they will continue to expand, especially as the Ottomans decline out of southern Europe. But this might be a good map to sometimes refer back to understand the geography of Austria. Now, ineffective Habsburg rule in the Holy Roman Empire forced monarchs to turn their attention inward and eastward to consolidate their diverse holdings into a strong unified state. Now, when we say ineffective Habsburg rule in the Holy Roman Empire, again, that really refers to how the Holy Roman Emperor was really a powerless position, and the Peace of Westphalia exacerbated that by empowering German princes and decentralizing the empire even further. So this is after the Peace of Westphalia. These monarchs will now really turn their attention to consolidating their rule and building up this Austrian Empire. In this tradition, the reorganization of Bohemia was actually a major step towards absolutism in Austrian history. I was just talking about this. The Czech, meaning the Bohemian nobility, were wiped out during the Bohemian phase of the 30 Years' War. And Ferdinand, who was the last Holy Roman Emperor with really any power, legitimate power, redistributed these Czech lands to aristocratic soldiers from all over Europe. And as a result, this was one of the regions where conditions for serf declined. This is one of those regions where Ferdinand empowered the nobility by granting them land and giving them power over their serfs and the peasants, basically, and in turn the nobility deferred to the power of Ferdinand. And the old hereditary provinces of Austria proper, that's that yellow region you see there on that map, that was centralized by Ferdinand III, who of course came after Ferdinand II. And that Ferdinand also created a permanent standing army, which, as we know, is a characteristic of absolutism, but this was also unprecedented for the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburgs had always depended on German princes and their armies. It was a very, very feudal tradition. And so when the Habsburgs finally established their own permanent standing army for their Austrian Empire, that is a huge indicator of how they're shifting their focus and really starting to establish that absolute state. And Hungary, again, this territory in dark and light purple, was the third and largest part of Austria's dominion and territory. But the Hungarians were a very different group than the Austrians. They're known generally as the Magyars. That's kind of like the ethnic term for many of the Hungarians there. They were the dominant cultural group, and they did not speak the same language or have the same culture as the Austrians as well. So you're probably already starting to pick up on an important theme here of the Austrian Empire, is that it's not all Austrians. It's actually going to be very multicultural, multinational as well. More on that later. And throughout this entire process, serfdom intensified in the Habsburg lands. So let's talk a little bit more about the government of the Austrian Empire, and I can expand a little bit more on what I just said about how Austria was a really multinational state. So what that means, first of all, and this is really important for understanding Austria because this is going to affect history all the way through World War I. In fact, we could say it's kind of what causes World War I. So Austria is not a national state. It is not homogenous. It is a multinational empire that included many, many different types of people. Simply in Austria proper, we had both Germans and Italians, And even if you go to Austria today, it is basic. The way I described Austria, especially the capital city of Vienna, having visited it, it's like if Germany and Italy had a baby and Paris was the nanny, that would be Vienna. And that's because it has like the cleanliness and the efficiency of Germany, but it has sort of the ambiance and the elegance of Italy, and also kind of a Parisian feel. Like a lot of the students who traveled with me on that Europe trip said that they thought Vienna was basically what they thought Paris would be. They were much more pleased with Vienna. And that's also my little plug to let you know that Vienna is an awesome city, and I totally suggest that you go visit it at some point. It is definitely one of the best cities in Europe. In addition to Austria proper, in Bohemia, there were Czechs and Germans, more ethnic groups. And in Hungary, we have the Hungarians, which are the Magyars, and the Serbs, and the Croats, and the Romanians. And we're going to see that as Austria expands more and more, especially into the Balkans, it's only going to become more diverse. So you can see in this graphic here, there's even groups that I haven't mentioned yet, because this shows a slightly larger Austrian Empire as we get, I think, maybe into the 18th, even 19th century. And there's going to be like 11 different nationalities there. And also with the Austrian Empire, there was no single constitutional system or administration that existed in the empire, especially because each region had a very different legal relationship to the emperor. So in a way, it's almost kind of similar to the Holy Roman Empire, more so than some of these other more consolidated states that we're seeing. Like it's not as decentralized, not nearly as feudal as the Holy Roman Empire was, because that's on its way out, obviously. But the biggest thing to remember, it's multinational, and so it's difficult for a lot of these groups to really identify with the government and the leadership in Austria, which are basically German Habsburgs, right? And so keep that in mind as we think about some of the difficulties the Habsburgs have in consolidating their power, and then also the sort of political motivations and cultural feeling of these other ethnic groups that don't feel like they're represented by the state. So a couple important Habsburg rulers to know, although the only one that's really important here is Leopold, and I'll explain why in a moment. So we've heard of Ferdinand II. We covered him already. He was really a big player in the 30 Years' War. He was like I said, the last really powerful Holy Roman Emperor who was trying to re-Catholicize the Holy Roman Empire. He also took control of Bohemia, which added to the Austrian Empire. So that's how he's relevant in this context for this lecture. And then Ferdinand III, his successor, centralized the government in the old hereditary provinces of Austria proper. And again, we mentioned he established that permanent standing army. And Leopold I was one of the more notable ones here. And you may remember I mentioned him when we were talking about the wars of Louis the 16th, or sorry, not Louis the 14th, excuse me. We'll talk about Louis the 16th later, but that's a much more interesting story for another day. Leopold I was still a very Catholic monarch, as we know the Habsburgs traditionally are. He severely restricted Protestant worship, and the Habsburgs will sort of continue to have issues with that longer than we generally see in other European states. Also, during the Battle of Vienna, or sometimes called the Siege of Vienna, he successfully repelled the Ottoman Turks from the gates of Vienna yet again in 1683. And this was really the last attempt by the Ottoman Empire to take any type of control in Central Europe, and this will really help to accelerate their decline, which I think I mentioned earlier. However, this was a pretty, big deal, a pretty big defeat, because Hungarian nobles who resisted centralization efforts of the Habsburgs, and like I said, didn't feel represented by them, couldn't identify with them, had actually supported the Ottomans. And part of this is because the Ottomans actually were like the better empire to live under. The Ottomans were more religiously tolerant and things like that. Yeah, they sometimes took your Christian children and made them like super crazy warriors, but win some, you lose some, right? Okay, more on this. In 1679, Prince Eugene of Savoy, so Savoy is in northern Italy, like northwestern Italy, where the city of Turin is, You may recognize that name also from an earlier lecture. So Prince Eugene of Savoy, who was Italian, led Austria's forces to victory over the Ottomans at Zenta. That was another battle, and thus securing Austria from future Ottoman attacks. And the Treaty of Karlowitz, which is not named after Mr. Karlowitz and his family, although it'd be funny if it was, the Treaty of Karlowitz gave Austria control of Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, which is in the Balkans, and this helped to establish Austrian Empire in southeastern Europe. So this led to a lot of expansion. So Leopold I defeated the Turks and he expanded the Austrian state. That's the way we can summarize that. Here you can see the portraits of the three Austrian Habsburg rulers that we were talking about. Starting on the left, that's Ferdinand II, and then in the middle, that's Ferdinand III, and on the far right, we have Leopold I. And they all have that very characteristic Habsburg jaw, although not quite as bad as poor Charles II from Spain, and that's because the Austrians had a little bit less inbreeding than the Spanish side, hence the reason they're still around. A little bit more on Leopold I want to share with you, though. Leopold, if you look at this, he kind of looks like Louis XIV in his style, right? He's got the big black curly hair, which is actually a wig, but in that same vein, he promoted a really fancy royal court in the city of Vienna, which became a cultural center of Europe. And Vienna, like I said, beautiful city, like a really classic European capital. And one of the palaces that the Habsburgs built there was called Schönbrunn, which I also highly recommend. So beautiful. I have some pictures of it coming up here. This was an Austrian royal residence designed to imitate Versailles. So again, we can see how Louis XIV and the Palace of Versailles and French absolutism really set the standard that is imitated by these other Eastern and Central European monarchs. And kind of like Louis XIV, Leopold wanted to reestablish devout Catholicism throughout his empire, and he viewed the church as an important institutional and ideological support for the imperial state. So he was still pursued that idea of religious unity, especially as a way to consolidate his own power. But we won't see too much of that beyond, I would say, the 18th century. Now, as we move into the 18th century, the last Habsburg monarch we're going to discuss for now is Emperor Charles VI. Under his leadership, Austria was saved from had been saved from French expansion during the War of Spanish Succession due to its allegiance with Britain and the military leadership of Prince Eugene, remember who was Italian. But don't worry so much about that. Charles is going to issue something called the Pragmatic Sanction in 1713. And we'll talk more about the Pragmatic Sanction when we get to Enlightened Absolutism and some of the political history of the 18th century. But essentially, Charles VI's only heir was his daughter, Maria Theresa. And Charles was concerned that since she was a woman, people might challenge her rule. And so he issued the Pragmatic Sanction basically to say that Habsburg possessions would never be divided and they always had to pass to a single heir, whether or not that was a woman. And so his daughter, Maria Theresa, inherited this Austrian empire as the token Habsburg ruler in 1740, and she ruled for 40 years. And she's actually a really successful, competent monarch of Austria during that time. And we will devote much more time to Maria Theresa another day. But as promised, here are some images of Schönbrunn. You can already see the similarities between it and Versailles, especially with the beautiful gardens and the size and the grandeur, all those little statues. This looks like it could be Versailles, especially with the fountain and the statue in the fountain. Very grand, very elegant. And then here's a glimpse of the interior. This is very much in the Baroque and even the Rococo style, which we haven't learned about yet, but very gold, fancy, the ceiling paintings. This should deliberately remind you of Versailles. Okay, moving on to Prussia. So Prussia is pre-Germany. Okay, I know we haven't talked about Prussia very much, and really when we've talked about Germany, it's been in the context of the Holy Roman Empire. But you need to remember that Prussia is pre-Germany. It is not pre-Russia. Russia will always be its own thing, and that's what we're going to end with today. And in Prussia, we will see the rise of the house of the Hohenzollern dynasty, and they will eventually become the first kings of Germany. So with the rise of Prussia, this actually began as a ruler of Brandenburg. So Brandenburg was a little state in what is essentially modern-day northern Germany. It was like in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire, and the ruler of Brandenburg was designated as one of the 7 electors in the Holy Roman Empire in 1417. So that means he becomes one of the most powerful and important princes in the entire Holy Roman Empire. But by the 17th century, Brandenburg was not significantly involved in the affairs of the Holy Roman Empire. It didn't play a major role in the 30 Years' War. And really, the Hohenzollern dynasty was concerned with expanding its territory, which it often did through marriage. Marriages to other important families in these North German territories increasingly gave the Hohenzollerns control of German principalities in Central and Western Germany. And at this point, the Prince of Brandenburg had little power over his nobility, even as he expanded his territory. And this, again, is really more in the context of the 15th and 16th centuries. But by the time we get to the 17th century, there'll be some more significant changes. Now, this is also another useful graphic here. We're just going to pause and take a look at it because it's going to help you understand the growth of Brandenburg and how it becomes Prussia, which is going to be kind of confusing, just to warn you. It starts out as a sort of a collection of different territories that are not consolidated, like they're not connected, as you can see. So like Brandenburg is there in the middle, and then the sort of darker kind of rust-colored things, those are territories gradually added, and all together they kind of make up Prussia. So Prussia is not one consolidated landmass as we're used to thinking of a state as, but you can imagine and see how it will eventually expand over time to be a more consolidated state that then becomes Germany. All right, so like I was saying, as we get to the 18th century, we will see the princes of Brandenburg, Prussia become more authoritarian and powerful, starting with Frederick William, the Great Elector. And I gotta warn you here, if you were annoyed by all the Louis and all the Henrys and these other countries that we've studied, and you keep thinking to yourself, like, oh my gosh, why can't they just name them Fred or Jackson or Bartholomew? Like let's shake it up, right? Okay, if that bugged you about France and England, the Louis and the Henrys, then Prussia is going to drive you nuts because they are all Frederick William or Frederick. It's really super confusing. You're just going to have to learn it, get over it, deal with it. It gets worse, all right? So anyways, this first one, this is just Frederick William, the Great Elector. He's actually not a monarch yet. That's how you can remember the difference and how he's unique. So he's the Great Elector. He had been a strong Calvinist in the sort of Prussia, Brandenburg territory, but he granted religious toleration to Catholics and Jews. He had also admired the Swedish system of government because Sweden was a pretty powerful state in Northern Europe in the 17th century. Like, remember Gustavus Adolphus. So he admired the Swedish system of government and also the economic power of the Netherlands, another significant state of the 17th century. And the ongoing struggle between Sweden and Poland for control of the Baltic, which is the Baltic Sea, of course, is sort of north of Germany and south of Scandinavia. It's those northern waters right there. So Sweden and Poland really struggled for control of the Baltic after 1648, after the 30 Years' War. And coupled with that, the wars of Louis XIV created an atmosphere of permanent crisis in much of Europe. Prussia, in fact, was invaded in the 1650s by the Tartars of southern Russia, who are kind of seen as like these barbarian people. Like they're not proper Russians, like Peter the Great, who we'll talk about. These are more like Mongol, like Asiatic type Russians. And this was a really actually significant invasion. They killed or carried off more than 50,000 people as slaves. And so this invasion weakened many of the noble estates of Prussia and strengthened the urgency of the electors' demands for more money for a larger army. So remember, at the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned that one of the reasons for consolidation was that threat of war and invasion and that instability. And that actually encouraged the nobles to sort of like all team up and get together around the monarch and empower the monarch so that they could create an army and be more protected. But Prussian nobles also refused to join, and so as a result, actually, Prussian nobles refused to join the representatives of towns in resisting royal power. So this is a situation where the nobles are like, no, we need to get with the monarch. And if we get with the monarch and support him, or he's not a monarch yet, if we get with the prince and support him, then we'll all be safer because we don't want to be invaded and carried off by the Tartars. Like that just sounds awful. So this is also an indication of how towns, were pretty weak and did not play a major role in Central and Eastern Europe like we see them in Western Europe. Here's a nice little image of Frederick William, the Great Elector. Again, Hohenzollern, not Habsburg, so he doesn't have that crazy big jaw. Now, the Great Elector established Prussia as a great power. This is why we're talking about him. And he laid the foundation for the future unification of Germany in the 19th century. He's really the first prince that matters here. And more significantly, he oversaw Prussian militarism and created the most efficient army in Europe. So we're starting to see the establishment of that tradition of German militarism. Like when you're trying to understand, like, the Nazis in World War II, like the roots of that go all the way back here to the Great Elector and how he began to establish these traditions of militarism into German culture. And so, again, if we think about that theme of identity, militarism, it becomes a big part of German identity, and that's all the way back to the 17th century. So kind of just keep that in the back of your mind as we, learn about Germany, especially as it becomes more of a legitimate state over the next few centuries. Okay, more on militarism. He employed military power and taxation to unify his Rhine holdings, so the Rhine River, and so his Rhine holdings were all his territories along the Rhine River. So going back here, you can see, I think the Rhine River is over on the left side near an area called Cleve. So that's what we mean by Rhine territories. So he used military power to unify his Rhine holdings, also in unifying Prussia and Brandenburg into a larger, more consolidated state. So it wasn't as scattered like we saw earlier. And he was able to increase military spending with heavy taxes. And these taxes were actually twice that of what Louis XIV was implementing on the people of France. So again, those heavy taxes were primarily used for the nobility, and this is really what allowed them to spill, these taxes were used for the military, and the nobility was not exempt like it was in many other places in Western Europe. And soldiers also kind of functioned as bureaucrats in Prussia. Soldiers also served as tax collectors and policemen, thus expanding the government's bureaucracy. Now, here's an important term that you definitely need to know, this idea of the Junkers. It looks like Junkers, but it's pronounced Junkers generally. The Junkers formed the backbone of the Prussian military officer corps. So Junkers, in the most basic definition, are German nobles, especially in the context of Prussia. Okay, so Junkers are like German nobles and landowners. As you can see, they dominated the estates of Brandenburg and Prussia, but they also are going to often make up the military officer corps. So Prussia has this powerful military, and one of the ways the Great Elector was able to get the nobles on board with this type of centralization was by offering them positions as officers in the military. Also, in 1653, the hereditary subjugation of serfs was established as a way of compensating the nobles for their support of the crown. So like I said, they got to be officers in the military, and also they got more power over their own serfs in exchange for supporting the great elector. And all government officials and army officers, including those Junkers, had to take an oath of loyalty directly to the elector. So you can see he's creating this culture of authoritarianism, and trying to create this atmosphere where the respect is expected, right? Like, yes, you can be nobles and still have some power over your serfs, but you have to acknowledge the supremacy of the great elector at this point. So Frederick William also encouraged industry and trade, which would help Prussia become a powerful state. He imported skilled craftsmen and Dutch farmers to help stimulate the Prussian economy. This resulted in the emergence of new industries such as woolen, so the wool industry, cotton, linen, velvet, lace, silk, so lots of textiles, but also soap and paper and iron products. But Prussia was not as successful in overseas trade, and this really has to do with the lack of their ports. They weren't situated on the Atlantic like France and the Netherlands and Britain, and they also did not have a lot of naval experience, which definitely set them back as well. So the next Prussian ruler is Frederick I, known as the Ostentatious, which basically means really, really fancy. He is significant because he is known as the first king of Prussia, and we'll explain how that happens here in just a moment. But that's really how we know, really what you need to know about him. And he has that little Roman numeral after his name. That's how we know he's a king. He was considered to be one of the most popular of the Hohenzollern kings. And like many monarchs, he sought to imitate the court of Louis XIV. And he also encouraged higher education, which is kind of a first among these absolute monarchs. He actually founded a university and encouraged the founding of an academy of science. And we will see this does actually correlate with the scientific revolution and its popularity, which we haven't discussed yet, but we will in the next unit. And he also welcomed immigrant scholars into Prussia, especially those that might have been kicked out of other less tolerant countries to the west, like France. All right, so let's talk about how he ultimately became a king. Like, how did these Prussian princes actually get to be like full-on monarchs? So the Prussian princes had been supportive against Louis XIV. All right, so they had often joined these alliances in the wars against Louis XIV to preserve the European balance of power. So Frederick I participated in the alliances for the 9 Years' War and also the War of Spanish Succession. He allied with the Habsburgs and supported them in maintaining the balance of power. So in the Treaty of Utrecht, one of the provisions in that treaty is that the elector of Brandenburg, Prussia, was now recognized internationally as a king. So he was now the king of Prussia in return for aiding the Habsburgs, and this is why he is seen as the first king of Prussia. But other than that, we don't pay much mind to him. The next king of Prussia of note is Frederick William I. This again is different than Frederick William the Great Elector, because this Frederick William is actually a king. He's got that Roman numeral in his name. All right, so this Frederick William I is nicknamed the Soldiers' King. And so again, think of them as their nicknames rather than their actual names, and that will help you. So we have Frederick William the Great Elector. We have Frederick I, ostentatious. That means he's really fancy and he's trying to be like Louis XIV. But even though he fights against Louis XIV, yes, I know that's ironic. And then we have Frederick William I, who is the Soldiers' King. And so that should already tell you a lot about this guy. So he was actually the most important of the Hohenzollern kings regarding the developments of Prussian absolutism. Like his father, he was a Calvinist, and he was also obsessed with finding tall soldiers for his army. Interpret that however you see fit. Regardless, he was a very very military man, all right? So you can see in his portrait, he's wearing a suit of armor. He always appeared in uniform. He personally supervised military training and drills. Like, he lived and breathed militarism. Okay, so even more than Frederick William the Great Elector, this guy infuses Prussian and German culture and identity with militarism. And that's exactly what the next point says. He infused militarism into all of Prussian society. So again, as we're thinking about that concept of German identity, we've got to go back to the 17th and 18th century and remember the Hohenzollerns. So Prussia basically was like a Sparta of the North. If you ever studied ancient history with the Greek city-states, you might remember that Sparta was like the militaristic state of Greece. And so Prussia is like the new Sparta, the Sparta of the North. One notable diplomat even once said, Prussia is not a state with an army, but an army with a state. And this meant that it wasn't just that they had a big military, it was like the whole culture and society had this element of militarism. Society was very rigid and highly disciplined. Unquestioning obedience was the highest virtue for Prussian people. And it was definitely the most militaristic society of modern times, at least before probably the Nazis, right? But the Nazis were also German, so, obviously there's a connection there. Frederick William I nearly doubled the size of the army, and it became to be the best army in Europe. It was Europe's fourth largest army after France, Russia, and Austria. So yes, it's possible to have the best army, but not be the largest. And frankly, France, Russia, and Austria were larger countries, so it makes sense they have larger armies. And Frederick William also created new forms of discipline and war techniques, new officer training, new soldier recruitment systems, and this is how he was able to double the size of the army during his reign. And 80%, a whopping 80% of the government revenues went towards the military. Like, that's more than any other state we've seen. But the Prussian army was designed to avoid war through deterrence, right? This is what's really ironic, is they actually didn't go to war that often. And part of it, I think, is because they had such a big, powerful army, like no one wanted to fight them. Like it was just too threatening. And so they just kind of scared people away. They didn't have to actually fight. So the only time Frederick William I actually fought a war was after Sweden briefly occupied a city in northern Germany. And as you can imagine, the Swedes lost that and they were forced out. Also, by the time we get to the 18th century, Sweden is not the powerful northern state that it once was. And that has a lot to do with Peter the Great, who we'll talk about shortly. Frederick William I oversaw the most efficient bureaucracy in Europe. He actually removed some of the last parliamentary estates and local self-government, so got rid of some of those last vestiges of feudalism. He also demanded absolute obedience and discipline from civil servants. In his bureaucracy, promotions were based on merit, meaning how good you were, how talented and capable you were, not who you knew, not who you know, or what your parents were, something like that. So merit, like your capability, is what allowed you to be promoted. And this meant that some commoners were able to rise to positions of power. And also, this was supported by high levels of taxation. Still, the Junkers remained the officers' caste, that means all the officers in the army, in return for supporting the king's absolutism. So yes, the nobles are still powerful, but again, they do also support the king. We can have it, both those things can coexist. And also, kind of continuing in this unique tradition of supporting education, the government was one of the first states to establish compulsory elementary education in the early 18th century in 1717, and it established approximately 1,000 schools for peasant children. Again, I think this was the first state in Europe to do this. Frederick William I's son was actually Frederick II. He's known as Frederick the Great. He's one of the most powerful and famous of the Prussian kings. And I'm going to deviate from the lecture here to tell you a little story about Frederick II. We'll talk about him a lot more in a later lecture when we get to enlightened absolutism, but since we're talking about militarism and his father, this is probably the better context for this little story about his youth. So Frederick William I, the soldier's king, we've established he lived and breathed the military. The only thing he cared about, the only thing he saw any value in. Well, his son, Frederick II, who was clearly going to be the heir to the Prussian throne, was not a military man. He liked art and culture and music and reading and his male friends, actually. And one of his male friends, whose name I cannot remember for the life of me right now, and I apologize for that because I don't have it in my notes. He and his male friend actually were more than friends, as you may have guessed. And when Frederick was a teenager, he and this friend decided to run away together. And so Frederick was like, you know what, I don't want to be king. I don't want to be like my father. And his father was always disappointed in him because he didn't want to, be a military man. He wanted to, do artsy stuff. And so Frederick ran away with his best male friend, who was also his more than a friend, like I said. And they ran away together. And his father was so angry about this that he had them hunted down, brought back to Prussia, and to teach Frederick a lesson, he had Frederick's friend executed right in front of him. So, while traumatizing, it did ultimately straighten Frederick out in more ways than one, and he assumed his role as the King of Prussia, and actually turned out to be a really, really awesome King of Prussia. He's actually considered to be an enlightened despot. That means an enlightened ruler for his incorporation of Enlightenment ideas into his reign, and we'll talk more about the Enlightenment and enlightened despotism in the next unit. And in doing so, he instituted a number of important reforms. And he also increased Prussia's territory at the expense of Austrian Habsburgs. He and Maria Theresa are going to have a long-standing rivalry. But like I said, that's later in the 18th century. And so that's going to have to be another story for another day, because now it is time to finish up this lecture by finally talking about Mother Russia. All right, so we have not talked about Russia at all yet in this course, which means I've got to give you a little bit of history and a little bit of context to understand why Russia, what's been going on in Russia basically since the modern period began. So, in the Middle Ages, Russia, what we know as Russia, basically emerged as a series of trading cities. Specifically like the city of Kiev in what is modern-day Ukraine, and then the city that we know now as Moscow. These trading cities, were located on trade routes north of the Byzantine Empire, and that's really how Russia modern, as we know it, began. And this also means that there was lots of Byzantine cultural influence in the development of Russia. For example, Russia adopted Orthodox Christianity. It still practices Orthodox Christianity today. It adopted the Cyrillic alphabet, which is the alphabet that is used in most Eastern European languages. It utilizes a lot of Byzantine architecture and art style, specifically, that kind of very gold and flat-looking type of art and architecture. It adopted the Byzantine legal codes from Justinian, and Byzantine culture really continued to thrive in Russia after the fall of Constantinople. Now, where Russia runs into trouble is actually with the Mongols. So the Mongols were these warrior nomadic peoples that conquered most of Asia, in the 13th through 15th centuries. You might remember that they also contributed to the Black Plague indirectly. But the Mongols had made it as far west as Russia. And Russia was the only area of Europe that the Mongols actually conquered and controlled during their empire. And this period is called the Mongol yoke. And a yoke is like a harness that you'll put on like a cow or an ox or a horse as they're pulling a cart. You might be able to imagine that, or even Google it, and see what that looks like. But imagine, like, Russia is being harnessed by Mongol occupation. That's what this phrase sort of refers to. And this is one of the key reasons why Russia lags behind Western Europe in its development. The Mongol yoke kept Russia very isolated. This, coupled with the fall of Constantinople, these two things kind of kept Russia isolated and distant from the rest of Europe. And so Russia misses out on the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration and the Reformation. Like all those really early developments, Russia experienced none of that, basically. All right. But even during the Mongol yoke, Muscovite princes, and so Muscovite refers to like the region of Moscow. You might be able to even recognize the word in there. So these Muscovite princes still held regional autonomy, and they were ultimately able to free themselves from Mongol rule by the late 15th century. And this was largely because the Mongol Empire itself was declining and the Mongols were abandoning lots of their regions to consolidate their power back in Mongolia due to crisis in leadership and things like that. All right, so the first Muscovite princes of note are mostly Ivans. We're not going through all of them, but I'll just tell you a few that are interesting. So first we have Ivan III, who is also known as Ivan the Great. And he was really the first Muscovite prince to use the term Tsar, which you have probably heard used to describe Russian kings. And the term Tsar actually comes from the term Caesar, right? You can hear that, Tsar and Caesar. And this is because Russia believed that they were inheriting the Roman tradition from Constantinople. Ivan III actually claimed to establish the third Rome at Moscow. So, of course, if the first Rome is the city of Rome during its empire, the second Rome was thought to be Constantinople with the Byzantine Empire. And then when Constantinople fell, because Russia had this Byzantine empire, all this Byzantine cultural influence, they believed that they were carrying on these traditions, right, of the of Roman and Byzantine culture and arts and the legal code and everything. So this also helps us understand a lot of sort of Russian identity in a way, and why Russia feels it's so powerful, but also very European. Ivan III also expanded Russian territory and enhanced the power of the Orthodox Church. Next, we have Ivan IV, who you may have heard of because he is often referred to as Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan the Terrible is really just kind of like this murderous egomaniac. That generally gets you the moniker of the Terrible, right? And he centralized the power of the Tsar at the expense of the boyars. We will learn that this term boyars, this is one you'll need to know, that's Russian nobility. So the Junkers are the Prussian nobility, the boyars are the Russian nobility. And he seized land from the boyars, who resisted, of course, these seizures, and in response, he brutally murdered them. And like I said, Ivan the Terrible was just basically this maniac, murderous maniac. He was paranoid. He was ferocious. At one point, he murdered his own son because he thought his son was conspiring against him. He beat his wife. He burned down a library. There's all these crazy stories about why Ivan the Terrible was a terrible guy. But basically, his terrible leadership is what ultimately helped to bring about a period called the Time of Troubles. And this shortly followed the rule of Ivan the Terrible. And this, basically, Ivan the Terrible had created like a crisis in leadership, right? And the boyars, the Russian nobility, used this opportunity to kind of scramble for their own power. There was competition among boyar families for the throne of Russia. There was lots of political and economic instability, lots of rebellions. Even Poland, Lithuania came over and attacked Russia for a while, and that's like literally the only time that will ever happen in history. So this map here also, this gives us some geographic context. I've been including these at the beginning of each of the lectures on these, or topics on these empires. So you can see that Russia began pretty small in kind of in the west there. Like, so you can see the city of Kiev, and then there's a Moscow and St. Petersburg. We'll talk about that later. But then it does eventually expand into the east and become, this crazy large country. All right. We frankly aren't going to ever ask you about the Ivans. Like, Ivan the Terrible is fun to talk about and read about, but he's not necessarily that relevant. Really, Russian leadership and the Russian monarchy is going to be dominated by the same family for like 300 years, and these are the Romanovs. The Romanov dynasty lasted from the ascent of Michael Romanov, the first of the Romanov czars, in 1613, all the way to the last Romanov, Nicholas II, who was executed in the Russian Revolution in 1917. So 300 years of the Romanovs, one of the longest lasting of any European dynasty, royal dynasty. So let's talk a little bit about Michael Romanov. Michael Romanov came to power in Muscovy, which is essentially Moscow, after the horrific time of troubles, which was basically a civil war. Michael Romanov favored the boyars, the Russian nobles, in return for their support. So again, we see this tradition of absolute monarchs in Central and Eastern Europe sort of striking a deal with the nobility in order to gain their support. So, for example, he reduced their military obligations significantly, and of course, he'll give them more power over the serfs. The Russian Empire was also expanded to the Pacific Ocean and the Far East. So this is when we start to see that dramatic expansion of Russia. And as part of that, Michael Romanov fought several unsuccessful wars against Sweden, Poland, and the Ottoman Empire. So he's, establishing some foundations for the Russian state, but he is not the greatest of the Russian czars by far. Now, Russian society continued to transform in the 17th century, and the general trends we're going to see is modernization and westernization. That's the direction we're headed. So the nobles gained more and more exemptions from military service. Again, that's part of the deal that Michael Romanov established so that they would support him. And related to this, the rights of peasants declined. There were Cossacks revolts. Cossacks, remember, are these like nomadic warrior farmers. And as the Cossacks revolted, and they're usually found in like Ukraine area, it resulted in further restrictions on serfs because no noble is going to like a peasant rebellion. Also, the old believers of the Orthodox Church, a very old sort of fundamentalist group of Orthodox Christians, resisted the influx of new religious groups from the West, so specifically Protestants like Lutherans and Calvinists. And these sort of crazy fundamentalist old believers actually burned themselves to death in protest. So over the course of 20 years, 20,000 members of this group burned themselves to death. And so they began to be viewed as fanatics, right? And not surprisingly, these old believers were severely persecuted by the government because they were sort of so extreme and fanatical, and in burning themselves to death, that attracts a lot of attention. And, politically, that's not something that the government wanted to keep around. In addition, Western ideas began to gain ground, especially as Russia has increasing contacts with Western Europe. For example, Western books were translated into Russian, new skills in technology developed, and also there were some notable differences. Some changes in clothing and customs occurred, such as men trimming their beards. We'll talk more about that later. The first translation of the Bible into Russian began in 1649. And by the start of the 18th century, in 1700, there were over 20,000 Europeans living in Russia. And shortly before that, it was clear that Russia was the world's largest country. With their expansion, they became 3 times the size of Europe, although a lot of that is very cold, snowy territory that's mostly uninhabitable, so don't get too excited. All right, now we come to the most important person in this part of Russian history, and that is Peter the Great. So Peter the Great is probably one of the most important czars in all of Russian history. Like, definitely, we're going to talk a lot about Peter the Great. You'll be asked about him. If you forgot about anyone else in Russian history, don't forget about Peter the Great. So a little bit of background. His sister Sophia actually ruled as his regent. So he and his half brother were there to inherit, basically, and their older sister Sophia was serving as regent. But Sophia thought she was going to keep all the power for herself, and so she established a plot to kill Peter. But this plot failed, and Peter, in return, had her banished to a monastery, and instead his mother, Natalia, took over as regent. And so Peter and his half-brother Ivan began ruling in their own right when Peter was 22. But as you can imagine, Ivan doesn't matter. We only ever talk about Peter. Now, one kind of funny thing about Peter, he was like a monster of a man. He was nearly 7 feet tall, and he was so strong he could bend a horseshoe with his bare hands. Like, he was basically this giant monster man. But he also was really intelligent and a really effective ruler. Okay. One of the first things he dealt with was something called the Revolt of the Streltsky. The Streltsky were these Moscow guards, kind of like the Praetorian Guard of ancient Rome. If you know ancient history at all, the Praetorian Guard had sometimes protected the emperor or overthrown the emperor, depending on what they saw as necessary. And the Streltsky had traditionally been able to overthrow previous leaders and kind of decide who they wanted as czar. But Peter knew this, and so he defeated the revolt of the Streltsky when they tried to overthrow him, and this really secured his power. This secured his reign, and he could definitely become a successful leader of Russia. I mean, that was pretty far into his reign, actually, but still, this was an important moment in defining his power. Now, like many other absolute rulers, military power was Peter's greatest concern. Each Russian village was required to send recruits to the Russian army, and they required 25-year enlistments. So, like our military, if you enlist, requires 4 years. The Russian military required 25 years. About 75% of the national budget was spent on the military by the end of Peter's reign. And the Royal Army, again, a permanent standing army that's loyal to the state, consisted of over 200,000 men, making it one of the largest armies in Europe because it had the population to support it, plus an additional 100,000 special forces of Cossacks and foreigners. Peter also established royal military and artillery academies to make sure he had well-trained officers and soldiers. He used Western technology, including cannons and firearms, and he made it so that all young male nobles were required to leave home and serve 5 years of compulsory education. And this was really a military-based education. One of Peter's most important military developments, however, is that he was one of the first Russian czars to pursue a navy. So he built a large navy on the Baltic, though it did decline after his death. But this is what made Russia more competitive with some of the other European states at the time. And like we saw in Prussia, there was a merit-based system where sometimes even non-nobles had the opportunity to rise through the ranks of the military and the bureaucracy. Now, one of the major turning points in the reign of Peter the Great, and really a turning point in the balance of power for Northern Europe, is an event called the Great Northern War, which took place in the early 18th century. It was happening at the same time as the War of Spanish Succession, but just on the other side of the continent. The Great Northern War was essentially Russia, the new power in the north, versus Sweden, the old power in the north. Now, for most of the 17th century, that's the 1600s, Sweden was the de facto great power in the north. Remember Gustavus Adolphus, the king of Sweden, had a really powerful military. He brought it in to help the Protestants to victory in the 30 Years' War. So Sweden was like the old power, but Peter the Great challenged that in the Great Northern War. And the result was the Treaty of Nystad. Basically, Russia wins this war. And Russia gains territory at the expense of Sweden. They gained the regions we now know as Latvia and Estonia, and basically gained territory in the Western Baltic. And this is what gave Peter the Great the window on the west in the Baltic Sea. This is what would allow him to develop, to really, further develop the Navy and trade, and have more connection with Western Europe, and ultimately build his city of St. Petersburg. Now, I mentioned earlier that modernization and westernization are the general direction that Russia is headed, but it is most notable under the during the reign of Peter the Great. And that's really what I want you to connect with right here, is that modernization and westernization are most associated with Peter the Great and then later Catherine the Great. So Peter the Great began this fascination pretty early on. He traveled to Western Europe as a young man in order to study its technology and its culture. And military technology was his primary concern, but he also visited like France and the Netherlands and kind of learned the best from each state, right? So he was learning everything he could, and he brought it all as much as he could back to Russia. He actually imported substantial numbers of Western technicians and craftsmen to aid in the building of large factories and reform the military. So he hired Western engineers and architects and technicians and craftsmen and scientists and said, hey, come back to Russia. I'll pay you as much as you want, and I want you to help me modernize and westernize my state. By the end of his reign, Russia outproduced England in iron production, which is really saying something, but also Sweden and Germany still produced more. And even though we're still far away from the Industrial Revolution, we're starting to see an industrial form of serfdom exist in some of these very early factories where workers could be bought and sold, kind of like slaves. Peter also created state-regulated monopolies, which sort of echo the mercantilist policies of Western Europe. He wasn't able to have as much definitively mercantilist policy as Western Europe because he didn't have the colonies and the trade to support it. And so actually this sort of stifled economic growth. And this is partly because industrial serfs created inferior products. Like in France, if there's monopolies over certain industries, it's because these are highly skilled, highly trained craftsmen who are able to produce excellent quality work. And in Russia, the serfs weren't able to compete with that. And lastly, on this page, Peter the Great is really famous for introducing a lot of Western fashion and etiquette. Even though we had started to see some of that under the earlier Romanovs, Peter the Great made it official. He said no more bearskin capes, no more big shaggy beards. He actually made it a law that and forced the nobility to cut their beards because he didn't want the Russians to look like these Eastern barbarians. And if you look at this portrait of Peter the Great, he looks like a European king, right? He doesn't look like this sort of barbaric Asiatic king. And if you were to Google pictures of say Ivan the Terrible or even Michael Romanov, they definitely have a very different, more Eastern style than we see with Peter here. So he introduced Western fashion and etiquette, no more bearskin capes. We're going to dress like the rest of the Europeans. We're going to shave our face. We're going to get rid of those beards. He also actually made Russian society a little less misogynistic, meaning it was a little bit friendlier towards women. So women were, for example, no longer required to be veiled in public. He instilled Western etiquette in his court. So he wanted to create a very sort of fashionable, fancy court like we would see in Versailles and other Western cities. Um, and he also placed less emphasis on arranged marriage and other misogynistic practices related towards women. So misogyny, in case you don't know, means like the hatred of women. And there was this really crazy practice in medieval Russia where during a marriage ceremony, so first of all, the marriage would always be arranged. Women were considered property, but like in even a more debasing way than we're used to seeing throughout history. So, for example, in this marriage ceremony, one of the traditions and the rituals is that the father would hand the husband, so the father of the bride would hand the husband of the bride a whip to represent how he was passing control of the woman to the husband. And so that literally is like, equating the woman with livestock, basically. Now, Peter the Great did away with that tradition and allowed Russian women to be treated more like Western European women, which is still not great, but it's better than being compared to livestock and cows. Okay, moving on. Under Peter the Great, the government became more efficient. Peter ruled by decree, so basically what he said became the law, kind of like the Pope in the Middle Ages, right? So this is another good example of absolute power. And in Russia, the Tsar theoretically owned all the land in the state. And so as a result of that, the nobles and the peasants served the state. There were also no representative political bodies, like at all. Like none of them ever existed. Whereas like in France, there wasn't a States General and Louis XIV just ignored it. No, there was no legislative branch of government here. And all landowners owed lifetime service to the state, either in the military, the civil service, or in a court. And in return, they gained greater control over their serfs. So again, this is a key factor in how the nobility are still able to have some power and independence, but also acknowledge the supremacy of the absolute monarch. One of the things that made Peter the Great's government more efficient was something called the Table of Ranks. And the Table of Ranks set educational standards for civil servants, most of whom were nobles. And this was kind of a more merit-based system of bureaucracy and promotion than we might see, say, in France or something. Although Peter sought to replace the old boyar nobility with a new service-based nobility loyal to the Tsar. So this actually is kind of similar. So I misspoke there earlier. So this is actually similar to what we are seeing in France with the nobles of the sword being pushed out from legitimate power and kings promoting more of those nobles of the robe. So that's what Peter is implementing here in Russia, in his government, with the Table of Ranks. All right, so the Table of Ranks is very similar to the nobles of the robe in France. And a common tradition in Russian government is that the secret police. Remember, secret police make inconvenient people conveniently disappear. And so the Russian secret police ruthlessly and efficiently crushed opponents of the state. And like I said, that's going to be a pretty common theme throughout Russian history, going all the way to, the 21st century. Peter the Great also had heavy taxation on trade sales and rent, and every male was expected to pay a head tax. That basically means that they had to pay a tax for existing, kind of like we do today. And Peter also turned the Orthodox Church into a government department in the year 1700. So it became sort of a state-run church. But one of Peter's greatest achievements is the city of St. Petersburg. Like I said, this was really his crowning achievement. He wanted to create a city that was similar to Amsterdam, in that it was a trading-based city, but he also built a palace called the Peterhof with the grandeur of Versailles. And yes, you're going to see some photos of Peterhof in just a moment. And this became one of the biggest cities in Europe. By his death, it was the largest in Northern Europe with over 75,000 inhabitants. And it became the capital of Russia. Today, the capital of Russia is Moscow, but that's because of the Russian Revolution, and we'll tell that story later. But for most of Russian history, St. Petersburg was the capital. And it was a very cosmopolitan city, meaning it was very fashionable and modern, and there was a lot of business there. It was a place to see and be seen, basically. Construction for the city began in 1703. Most of the later was conscripted. That means it was forced, kind of like slave labor, basically, Russian peasants. And Peter, sort of taking some cues from the style of Louis XIV, ordered many noble families to move to the city and build their homes there according to Peter's plan. So again, the nobles had to come sort of live in St. Petersburg, and so Peter could keep an eye on them. Merchants and artisans were also ordered to live in the city and help build it. And like I said, peasants were conscripted for the heavy labor in the city's construction. And this was actually a pretty gruesome experience. And it's said that, the conditions for the peasants were so brutal that the death toll could have been as high as 100,000 peasants that died while building the city. So as promised, here's a few pretty pictures of Peterhof Palace. You can see the resemblance with Versailles and Schönbrunn. These are all really quite similar in sort of that Baroque grand style. This also has really impressive gardens. These are modeled a little bit more directly off of Versailles. Schönbrunn did not have the same level of opulence in the gardens, although it's still very, very pretty. And here's the inside, and as you can see, it looks almost exactly like Schönbrunn and very similar to Versailles. Lots of gold, the painted ceilings, really fancy. So this becomes a common standard for European monarchs in the 17th and 18th century, was to have these big, fancy palaces, and of course Versailles was the standard. And so to wrap things up, Peter's reforms modernized Russia and brought it closer to the European mainstream. Overall, a more modern military and state bureaucracy were created, and this also represents an emerging concept in the interest in the state, as separate from the Tsar's interest, which developed. So this really speaks a lot to the development of like Russian culture and Russian identity, but also Russia had a very authoritarian government, and that's going to remain true really throughout most of Russia's history. And this was, of course, really solidified by Peter the Great. Peter began issuing explanations to his decrees to gain popular support, but this still speaks to the tradition of authoritarianism. So authoritarianism continues in Russia throughout the next few centuries. And it's going to be actually one of the things that prompts the Russian Revolution, this absolute authoritarian government. But then we will see the Russian Revolution continues with traditions of authoritarianism, quite ironically. But Russia will continue to struggle to keep up with Europe over the centuries. It's going to fight wars. It's going to be competitive with trade. It's going to marry into other European monarchies. It will decide, basically it decided with Peter the Great that it's definitely a European country, but it will still struggle to keep up. And as we get to, like, say, the Industrial Revolution, the 19th century, Russia will fall farther and farther behind, and that's largely due to its entrenched serfdom. And these are the conditions that will ultimately create the opportunity for the very violent and the real earth-shattering Russian Revolution of 1917. But that's another story for another day in second semester. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture on absolutism in Central and Eastern Europe. We again talked about Prussia, Austria, and Russia. So make sure to review your notes. There's a lot of information here, and we will do some activities in class to answer any questions you have and also clarify some of the most important information. Thank you for listening and have a good night.